Now there's a part that's going through my mind all the time. Libero. That's right. The world's greatest football podcast is back. Brought to you by Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and producer Tom in the booth. Now, football is the most important of the least important things, as Patrick Bateman got printed on one of those business cards he slid across the table in American Psycho. Yes, listener, that is bone, and the lettering is Celial Braille. Okay. Today I'm joined by Jonathan Wilson, a man who's actually written more books than Bret Easton Ellis and killed more people than Patrick Bateman. I joke, Wilson has not killed anybody. He has made it hip to be square, though, and he does love to promote adverts, which, you know, judging by the comments in last week's pods, did we get adverts? We don't know, but I'm going to plug his latest book, The Power and the Glory, A History of the World Cup, out in all good bookshops. I would go and support your independent bookshop rather than that billionaire who basically rents Venice for his wedding, so please do that. And flanking Wilson is, of course, Miguel Delaney, a man who, when he wakes up in the morning, if his face is a little puffy, he puts on an ice mask while he does his stomach crunches. That is why Miguel is looking so fresh for our viewers on Spotify, because you can now watch us on Spotify and on YouTube as well. I am James Horncastle, the only Libero member who can get a table at Dorsia. I am from The Athletic. Miguel, I'm going to come to you first. You were at the North London derby to see an Eze hat-trick, but also what is known in Italy as a scenografia, scenery, a staging, a choreografia, but it is known on social media as a tifo, which is a word Italians don't use to describe what Arsenal paid their fans to hoist before the North London derby. A typhus is what that translates as. This is one of my bugbears. What did you enjoy most about the North London derby?
I suppose sending you a message describing something as a tifo. That was probably the best part, to be fair. Arsenal were very, very good. So apparently, after the game, from what I'm told, the injured players, I suppose Arsenal are kind of big into this sort of thing, and Arteta tries to cultivate this, but the injured players went into the dressing room before their victorious teammates to give them a kind of a mini guard of honour. That's how they felt about the performance. To be fair, it did feel like the cliche of a statement performance. I thought it was their best of the season so far. Apparently they felt it. And Spurs just couldn't get close to them. Spurs were a bit of a joke, really. And I like Thomas Frank a lot. I think he'll be good there, but what they tried yesterday just didn't work. What, a 5-4-1, man for man. Arsenal just kind of eventually moved them around the pitch, and a lovely little pass from Marino before another cliched statement performance from Eze.
Wilson, you're wearing a black armband today because someone called Nikita Simonian passed away.
It's in a Substack. Didn't click on that one.
You can read some of Wilson's work on Simonian, some of his famous interviews with him. I imagine, was this told in Behind the Curtain, Rory Smith's favourite book from the Wilson canon, or?
It is in Behind the Curtain, yeah. So, but Simonian was one of the greats of a Soviet game. He won the League and Cup as a player at Spartak, as a manager at Spartak, and then remarkably went to Ararat Yerevan and won the double there in 1973. So whatever you're looking at, and then he became an administrator, whatever you look at, he was front and centre of the Soviet game. He was also a teammate of Eduard Streltsov and took his place for the final of the 1956 Olympics. And I felt quite bad for him when I interviewed him. I felt quite bad for him for two reasons. So one is that he must just get asked about his former teammates all the time. And do you think Streltsov committed rape? You were with him the day before it happened, whatever it was that happened. You know, what did you see? And this is actually the most important person in the history of Soviet football, being asked about something totally different. But he was very gracious about it. And I also felt sorry for him because I was more hungover for that interview than I've ever been for any work I've ever done. I'd had a coming together with a bottle of vodka the night before. I'd fallen asleep on the metro. I'd been robbed. I was not in a good state. And from memory, which admittedly isn't the sharpest, he seemed incredibly gracious and charming and interesting anyway. So he was 99. He died yesterday. And I mean, he's 99. He's lasted a long, long time, but he is one of the all-time greats, maybe the all-time greatest of Soviet football.
Which brings on to the subject of episode 73 of Libero. Was the Soviet League easier to retain than the Barclays?
Well, Simonian never retained, actually. So maybe it's very similar.
What a segue. I've actually just realized the mug I'm using today is from the 2018 Russia World Cup. That is not a comment on anything political. That is just, I happen to have a mug from a lot of events and clubs I go to, and I like this one, but...
Miguel has a 28-point plan agreed with the Americans on why the Premier League is so difficult to retain, which is what we're going to be talking about today.
But what we're seeing here, James, is sports washing up.
So, Liverpool FC, I don't know if you saw this at the weekend, but they lost 3-0 at home to Sean Dyche's Nottingham Forest. Sean Dyche, who presumably got the tactics for that win from Inverting the Pyramid, a book he has read and promoted in a recent press conference. What do we think's going on specifically at Liverpool? I know we've had Liverpool-focused podcasts at the moment, but we seem to have, just when you think it can't get any worse, it has. Mig, why is this title so difficult for them to basically defend after spending £400 million in the summer?
Well, this isn't fully about Liverpool, we should stress. It does reflect kind of just how, like, the extent of this decline. Superficially, it feels of a trend that we're going to get into, which is that a lot of recent champions over the last decade have had sudden downturns, and some of them quite drastic downturns after they won the title. I'm actually minded to think some of that is coincidence because they all have individual explainable factors. And one of them with Liverpool, although a lot of this actually doesn't seem all that explainable and how bad they've been, especially after spending over 400 million on talent and some of the top talent in world football. Now, obviously, there is the issue that is much more serious than anything to do with football, which is the tragic passing of Diogo Jota. Now, I must say, I've taught this a lot, and I did a piece at the start of the season. It does feel a little bit jarring to be linking a genuine human tragedy to football results, but this is the context the players are playing in. And really, like, it's actually a great unknown. We have no idea what impact this is having on the players. It's possible that this is one reason why they've struggled with setbacks in games, something that has been a real feature. It feels like if Liverpool go behind, they're just done, whereas if they go ahead, they're able to kind of get through. You know, obviously it would have had a profound effect on preseason, on new players coming in. So that is there. It's going to do something. You saw Andy Robertson's interview after the Scottish game, although I actually did think it was quite striking that the first time he felt to kind of mention in that way was after a success rather than a failure. And maybe that's a conscious thing in itself, that because Liverpool don't want to be seen to be using this as an excuse. So I think that is, I think the emotional effect of that is all there. But the emotional effect of that is also on it. It does feel like there are some purely football elements that you can question as well. Not least the fact that we've mentioned before, they don't seem to know what their best system is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point with Jota, Miguel's absolutely right, that it clearly is a factor, but it's very, I mean, this is probably, this is going to sound like a journalist's excuse, and I guess to an extent it is. It's almost impossible to write about because it just sounds so, I mean, jarring was the word used, and I think that's right. It sounds absurd. It sounds that you're trivializing his death if you start writing about it in terms of what it means for Liverpool this season. And yet it clearly does have an enormous impact. Also, I kind of feel really uncomfortable writing about it because the truth is we don't know. We can speculate as to what it is meant to individual players, and we have a sort of sense of which players he was close to in the dressing room. But for us to kind of try and guess what that impact is wrong. It's unethical. We shouldn't do it. So I think with any discussion of Liverpool, you have to say this is a factor. We don't really know how it's manifesting. We don't really know how it will manifest, but it is a factor. And then we move on to other things. But it's also clearly had an impact on the transfer policy because they probably, or But I mean, would have been less likely, I think, to sign two centre forwards had he been there. It forces them to change what they're going to do. And so then you have the situation where you look at Liverpool now and you think, well, hang on, if this was working, what would it look like? Which players would be in their putative first 11? And that's a really difficult thing to say. But maybe that itself has been conditioned by the fact they've had to, and again, this sounds really jarring, and I apologise if it sounds insensitive. I don't mean it to be. They've had to adapt for the fact they've had to replace Jota.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we don't really know about, as you both laid out, in terms of the actual impact it's having on their day-to-day lives and their performances. The things that we can sort of look at, I suppose, are the number of signings, how they've been integrated. Should they not be doing better by now? We are at the end of November as well. And if they're not integrating in the way that they should be, can Slot just play most of the team from last year that is still at the club? Or has he not been able to do that because he's had injuries and he has to rotate the team because they play every 3 days? You know, Miguel, what do you think is like systemic about this? Because a lot of people say like Slot has no plan at the moment, which I always resent that kind of analysis, because of course a manager has a plan. He goes into a game with a plan in every game. But like, do you think what he's tried hasn't worked? It's meant players have lost confidence in what they do. Like, what are they grasping at here?
It's actually been really notable over the past few weeks. Look, sometimes you try and shut out a lot of the social media noise, but it's part of the world we live in. It does frame discussion, as we've discussed on previous pods. And it has been notable, really, how a lot of the noise around Liverpool is basically really critical of Slot more than anyone else. I must say, I think that's a bit harsh. I think there's a lot there. If you're talking about issues for one specific season, I mean, Liverpool might be well vindicated over the course of 5, but my question would be more about recruitment and the squad that's been put together and what it's left Slot with, and giving him some quite difficult decisions in that way. What's really striking, a friend of mine who has a background in football analytics and has been desperate for mention in the pod because other friends of mine have mentioned Joe Mitchell. He made so there you go. No, but he made a good point where he likened it to a golfer practicing a new swing. So he's obviously you could say the old swing is the team with Salah in it and all that, and the new swing is going to be what it is with Isak, with Wirtz in a playmaking role. And it's like he hasn't. First of all, that's going to take some adaptation time, and while he's adapting, there are going to be a lot of problems, and we're going to see some ropey performances. But secondly, it feels like he hasn't fully committed yet between one or the other. And we're seeing this constant back and forth. And obviously, this is the level of a club like Liverpool, or a champion club, that we're going to get into, that once you're there, like the demands are so high, the pressure to win is so high, that, and maybe this is the way you could have a criticism of Slot, that it's like he's not holding his nerve in terms of what the system, where at this point there is an argument he should say, right, this is the team going forward. Yes, over the next 10 games, it might be difficult, but we've got to commit to what this is. Again, that is, I would say, an external, superficial reading. But when you see the way the team keeps going back and forth in a way that doesn't feel like it's the tactical variation that you would associate with Slot last season, say, it does feel an issue.
Let's get on to the wider theme then of this podcast, which is just how hard this league appears to be to retain. I mean, in the last 15 years, we've had a couple of, 3 kind of big title defenses that have collapsed. You've got Mourinho's second spell at Chelsea, what Conte called the Mourinho season. You've then got Conte winning the league, and then in his second season, he wins the cup, but they finish 5th, and he's ultimately sacked. Wrongful dismissal, I think. He ended up going to court for that and winning. And then you got Leicester with Claudio Ranieri. Wilson, are there any commonalities between them? I mean, the only one I can see is that Conte's Chelsea and Ranieri's Leicester, both Italians. When they won the league, neither of those teams were in Europe. They win the league, all of a sudden they're playing Champions League football. They've got more on their plates, and that has an impact. This kind of, in Chelsea's kind of thing, I think Conte wanted different signings, more signings. Are there any commonalities between those 3 cases?
I mean, I think Miguel's right that you can look at specific things in each case, but I also think that those are probably exacerbated by the very fact they are champions. And that maybe just lowers the level by 5% or whatever. And maybe you could get away with that. Yeah, you could get away with your other issues if you weren't that 5% lower, that anybody who's ever achieved anything, even they've struggled for a long time, you know that when you start to try and do it again, it's quite hard to kind of find the drive and the motivation to keep going. So that alone probably wouldn't be enough to stop you winning the title. But when you have that combined with a couple of other factors, then it probably is. I mean, I think if you look across the Premier League era, there's only been 7 teams who have who've won the title, who've then improved their points tally the following season. So even teams who have defended, and there haven't been very many, there's only been 3 managers who've been able to do that. It's only been Ferguson, Mourinho and Guardiola who have retained. Even when they have done it, the tendency has been to do that at a slightly lower level. So I think that is probably explicable almost entirely by a diminution of hunger. It's just really hard to keep going. Ferguson always said that. Ferguson always said that anybody can win a title, only great sides can retain a title. And I think that's obviously true.
I might quibble with the first one at the moment.
Well, I think they will win it this year now. But yes,
will they retain it next year though? Probably not.
Well, yeah. And I think looking at Liverpool in that context, the biggest drop-offs we've seen is 37 points, which was Chelsea under Mourinho, then Leicester, so successive seasons. I think Liverpool dropped off by 30 points. And this Liverpool now, if they carry on at their points per game rate that they're going at, well, the points per game rate over the full 12 games, I mean, you can argue that actually the truer form is what they've shown over the last 7 games, which is far worse. But if you do protect that out, I think they'll be 27 points worse off this season than last. So this could be, if it keeps going as it is, it could be the 4th worst title defence in Premier League history.
Well, they'd have something like 10 points to be near the bottom had it not been for those late winners at the start of the season, which is remarkable. We just on the kind of wider point about being champions, just because you said it there, something kind of struck me. Because in a lot of these cases, actually, there are specific manager issues that started the season. They actually won the title. And again, maybe this is connected to kind of when you're in the process of going for it, that kind of sustain things. But if you go through it, first of all, I would say, I'd almost dismiss Leicester from this entire discussion because I think they so overperformed and it was such a freak that they were just destined to regress. And and obviously kind of given they'd won, I suppose it was...
Well, yeah, if you just come in on that, I totally agree with you in the broader sense. However, there's a regression to the mean. And maybe what we're seeing all the way through is to an extent a regression to the mean. But to some extent, you're winning a title. If you win a title on goal difference or by 1 or 2 points, they're tiny fluctuations over the course of a season. So if your par is to win, 2.3 points per game, and one season you get 2.31 and that wins you the title, and the next season is 2.29 and that means you miss out by a single point, you haven't really got worse. It's just that there has been some kind of regression. And I think Leicester's the extreme case of that. But maybe that is what we're seeing more generally. And that sort of allies with that diminution of hunger to just lower the level by, 5-8%.
And I suppose, it could be that kind of individual hunger to try. Because, if you look at some of the teams we've mentioned there, one of the first I'm thinking of, although they actually ended up finishing second, Manchester City in 12-13, after the first title under the Abu Dhabi ownership. But there are so many stories covered in States of Play, actually. A book that's up for William Hill this Tuesday.
But Migs, the truth is anybody can win a William Hill. The key is to defend it.
I'd implore you to look through the list of winners and that. But the season they won the title, there are so many stories about how the players just, some of them really hated Mancini. They talk about how he spoke to them. There were so many players where he'd say to them, "Never speak to me again," before I'm picking him for the next game. Obviously, the kind of the peak of this, or nadir, was what happened with Tevez, who he eventually had to call back. So all this was coming together for the next season when they just kind of dropped off and really were nowhere near a Manchester United, who were propelled by Van Persie and I suppose Ferguson's own personal sense, without telling other people yet, of winning that last title. Mourinho 2015-16. So I covered both of those seasons. I was at Mourinho press conferences every week. And I remember being told that as you say, that became the notorious Mourinho season. It was really the first, I suppose, of these drastic collapses we've seen, like these kind of runs of defeats that you just hadn't previously associated. Well, we've seen it from what? Chelsea in 2 seasons, City last season, although they corrected it after spending 250 million in January, Liverpool in 2 seasons. But from what I'm told, what happened there was, obviously one of the great things in Mourinho's career would be that, above anything else, he was obviously at his best and in a different era of football, a tactical genius, brilliant at responding to how opposition played. So in 14-15, the game was already starting to evolve. But Mourinho's best ability was basically kind of the spell he'd have over players. I remember being told by people in the dressing room that in the middle of that 14-15 season, and people might remember, he went on rants about refs after a 1-1 draw at Southampton. He went on about the minutes after a game against Burnley. And apparently, from what I'm told, he used to go on about refs in the dressing room a lot, kind of like telling the players, you've got to bring this up. And it was like the players actually, given they were like pretty much cruising to a title, the players were a bit kind of struck by this. And it was one of those kind of, again, just passing on what sources told me, these realizations basically, like, that kind of, snowballed into something else. And as it was put to me, the spell was broken. So then by the start of the next season, when there were already actually some problems with recruitment, just that effect wasn't there. And the football, I suppose maybe it was starting to look outdated. And they really fell off a cliff. Similarly with Conte, I suppose, he had the Diego Costa issue in 16-17 when they won it, that then obviously set a tone for everything to follow after they won the title, when Costa just showed journalists, here's this message that Antonio has sent to me.
A great Barclays moment.
Yeah. Not enough characters in the game like that anymore. I've heard it show any text messages from managers. But I suppose that's what I mean in terms of like I think some of these cases are so individualized. But maybe you're right that it's to get to the title in the first place and who you need to get to do it that maybe is making this more and more, especially when you've got 4 or 5 teams that could feasibly win a league, unlike any major league in Europe, really.
So I think that's a key point. I mean, why did Bayern keep winning? Why did Juve have that run where they keep winning? Why did Real Madrid and Barcelona keep winning? Why did PSG keep winning? Well, they're just much bigger than everybody else in their respective leagues. Juve were at the time. They can have an off season and still win the league fairly comfortably, whereas the Premier League, thankfully, has retained that competitiveness. But I also think, and it's such a familiar cycle that maybe we don't even bother to talk about it, but we see in a whole range of spheres, not just football, success breeds complacency, breeds decay. And so when I'm talking about lack of hunger, it's not necessarily just players. It's also, I think, you look at directors, you look at managers, and whereas your temptation, if you finish second by 2 or 3 points, your instinct in that summer will be, if we sign 2 or 3 more, we can get over the line. If you won the league by 2 or 3 points, I think the tendency is to think, it's all fine. We don't need to do anything. Well, what we don't want to do is rock the boat. We don't want to, we don't want to drop an outside element into this system that's working that could cause it to fall apart, which I think is actually one of the things Liverpool have done. They've changed so much this season that, I mean, the other thing is we could see it coming. Jamie Carragher said last season, Liverpool need 6 new players. And there's some sort of scorn at that. But I think most people thought, they probably could. But then when you do that, of course, it creates this great upheaval and you lose the internal rhythms and dynamics that have led them to the title.
You could feel it in the League Cup final. I remember, I think I posted about it. I maybe even mentioned on Libero during that game or after that game, that as good as they'd been and as much as they've been champions, they look short in a lot of areas. And and this has come up a fair bit now this season, although I would say it was less apparent at the time that teams had started to figure them out from February onwards. But some of that could be connected to the fact that they were so far ahead that they just switched off. And, it's possible we're seeing some of that as well. But I suppose what you're saying there, Jonathan, it's a bit like the classic kind of sporting, kind of almost philosophical dichotomy between a hunt and a lauda, isn't it? Yes, I have seen the film Rush. But basically, both have this kind of incredible talent. One is basically just content with one title, like that's enough vindication, because it cuts to kind of the Roy Keane sentiment as well. When he brought up similar about Dwight York, I think how he felt, York was enjoying his success after winning at United. And he moved along soon enough after those 3 titles in a row that involved the treble. But for some people, it's basically it's all about the happy celebration of victory. Whereas for the real top winners, it's actually about the fear of failing.
Well, I look at the 3 managers you have retained. Mourinho, when he was at his peak, Ferguson and Guardiola, all incredibly intense people. And I often think this about top sports people, but maybe what I mean is that sort of top sports person who drives themselves to keep going, keep doing it. There's actually something quite disturbing about it. I also used to think this about Steve Redgrave, when you think that the sacrifices he made his family make for 20 years, he wouldn't be there because he'd be training to win. And at some point, could somebody not have said, Steve, you sure you need a 5th one? Like, he's certain that you need that. And I think the more human response is to think, well, that's great. I'll just sit back a bit for a couple of years, and then maybe the hunger's re-inspired. I think to have that drive to keep going makes you a really difficult person.
I think it's a good time for me to pull the oars in on part 1, get off the ergo machine, and have a little bit of a break. We'll be back to further discuss this topic in a couple of minutes. Wilson, what you were saying about Steve Redgrave there, just being kind of so obsessed, when you were also talking about Miguel, that fear of failing, a fear of losing, almost like if you are a Ferguson, a Guardiola, or a Mourinho, you are kind of condemned to win by your track record, and that anything else is seen as failure. Like in my experience, this is Antonio Conte all over. Conte really likes to say how hard it is to win, how hard it is to retain a title. He's had some of the same issues as Liverpool this year, in that Napoli signed 9 new players, and he was like, we've bought too many players, which a lot of people were just saying, Antonio, this is a new excuse. Well done for coming up with it. There is an element of, on the one hand, too much change. I mean, looking at the league I cover, the Serie A, the last 6 years, you've had 4 different champions. And like Napoli's really bad collapse a couple of years ago came from them changing the coach, which Spalletti left. And a lot of people said, okay, well, Napoli got the choice after Spalletti, Rudy Garcia, wrong. But a lot of these Premier League teams have continuity of manager. Surely continuity of manager, holding on to that guy who's won you the league, should be an advantage, no? And yet, not in the Barclays, it seems.
Yeah, but I mean, I think managers change or circumstances change, and managers can or can't adapt to that. I think something I've become really aware of recently, I was actually Ange Postecoglou, watching him at the same time as Gary O'Neill's descent, really brought home that you have somebody who looks really good to start with, and then they start losing, and people start criticizing, people start asking questions, and players maybe start to doubt. And you almost see the light goes out in their eyes, and they become paranoid. Because they're football managers at a high level, they don't really doubt themselves, because once they've done that, they really are finished. But they start believing that there's this conspiracy against them from referees, from players, from journalists. And basically, once that's happened, it's really, really hard to get it back. I was talking to the owner of a football club last week, who was saying that they've had to sack 3 managers and they've hated doing it every time. But by the time they have carried out the sacking, they said it's been a bit like having an elderly dog, where you realize it's just the kindest thing, that this is over and all you're doing is prolonging the suffering by pretending this can work. And I sort of think that is what it's like. That I'm not saying Arne Slott's necessarily got to that position yet, and he obviously has credit in the bank, but I don't think we're a million miles away from saying, well, yeah, he won the league last season. I think the idea that he somehow fraudulently won a Jurgen Klopp title, I think that's wrong. I think you saw things he did last season that were different. I think the way he changed things within games suggested his quality as a coach. But that doesn't mean that things can't go wrong. And once Jurgen Klopp has come back from a very bad season, so it is possible, but it's really, really hard for a manager, once they get in that downward spiral, to drag themselves out of it.
I mean, this is probably a discussion more about kind of like what happens when any manager is losing a team and on the road to being sacked, rather than necessarily champion on the downturn. But it's the same sort of thing. I mean, you often get it when, especially having covered Chelsea a fair bit, you start to write about the decline of a manager, and you know from what you're hearing inside the club, from what you're hearing inside the dressing room, something is broken. And initially, there are enough results to kind of just about withstand the kind of wider noise. And like when you start to kind of write about this and hint about it, you get a lot of kind of pushback saying, man, like, no, this is the press trying to get a manager sacked. But it's not. It comes from what we're hearing and the very idea that, as like Jonathan said there, something has changed. And I suppose I used, obviously it's more pronounced from Mourinho given who he is and how he works. But the spell is broken in the same sort of way.
And then just come in with a Bella Gutman quote, which is relevant.
Wow, we've got Wilson bingo today. So behind the curtain, Soviet League coach, and now Bella Gutman. Let's have it.
So Bella Gutman said, a coach is like a lion tamer. If he shows a flicker of doubt, he is dead. And this is it. As soon as they start to lose, the little flicker of doubt is there and the players are going to maul them.
No, and of course, what was Ferguson's great response? But of course, Ferguson had more control of any club anyway, especially after he'd eventually won those first trophies. But on that, I suppose, because given we're talking about kind of the English perspective here, although albeit with a lot of Italian managers, because it feels like Italian football has probably been more philosophically and ideologically framed by the idea of just winning, of the binary concept of winning, than English football, right down to how, say, like, the kind of national football identity was shaped by Catenaccio for years. The fact that Juventus, the kind of most, the most frequent champions, have what's the slogan again? Winning isn't important. It's the only thing that counts. What's the kind of the view and all that?
Well, look, I mean, it's something that often is brought up as a mentality that holds Italian football back, and in the wider world, particularly when it comes to being competitive, given the changes in modern football and in the Champions League. And so, yeah, I mean, there's been a culture war that's been going on in Italy for the last 10 years, where you have kind of a new generation of pundits who, have, greater access. It's easier to watch Spanish football, Premier League football, Bundesliga football than it was, 10 or 15 years ago. Football is everywhere. It's on your phone. It's you can see different styles and different ways of playing in a way that you just couldn't before. And so that's opened the minds of a lot of Italian pundits who kind of really championed Roberto De Zerbi as being the difference maker. This is the guy who is plowing a new furrow. We need to follow Roberto De Zerbi. He is the future. And yet the backlash always, and De Zerbi hates this because he became a lightning rod for a kind of culture war he didn't want to be a lightning rod in. But the backlash was, but what's De Zerbi ever won? Nothing. Look at all those silly goals his teams give away, playing out from the back. Just launch it, for God's sake. And, at the moment, there's a real regression, I would say, going on in Italian football, because on Sunday night, it was the Milan derby. AC Milan won, even though I would say Inter play a more progressive style of football. Certainly, Simone Inzaghi's Inter was very kind of fluid, positional interchanges, felt very kind of avant-garde, and that's been carried on by his successor, Christian Chivu. AC Milan, coached by Max Allegri. Allegri's philosophy is cortomuso. Allegri loves horse racing. And again, that philosophy that he stands by, cortomuso, is doesn't matter how you win. If you win by a nose, you still win. And they won 1-0 with their counter-attack from Christian Pulisic. So,
not a process, man.
No. To be honest, I think that the pressure in Italian football, whenever Italians come to coach in England, they always remark upon how pressure light it is in terms of the narrative around football, which creates pressure. Because in Italy, there was this tendency in the past to go through 3 or 4 coaches in a season. So you're always one game away from the sack. There are 3 sports newspapers there which have to fill 60 pages a day about football and football only, in the way that there isn't really here. We have the back pages, yes. We now have The Athletic, yes. But we've never had that kind of, the same kind of media volume that there is in Italy, which again turns it up in terms of you have to win and win now, otherwise you're out. Forget about your philosophy. You need to get this done. And that creates a very hardened mentality in the way these coaches operate. It's why more Italians have won the Premier League than any other nationality.
I given we are, I suppose, looking at the concept of winners too. Like the other great example that I'd be familiar with is Spain. Now, obviously, there is a distinction here because the two big clubs are insulated and amplified by 30 years of Spanish financial regulations, and a point where at one point like they had 90% of all TV revenue going to them. But even within that, I suppose, I mean, Barcelona, almost on the other side of it, I feel they've actually usually been almost kind of constantly undermined by their own neuroses, unless they have almost the comfort blanket of a working ideology, which obviously saw with Cruyff and Guardiola. And once that disrupts, then, or once that the blanket is pulled away by whatever issues, they fall apart. Whereas Madrid just, and I don't think, you might correct me, in Italy, there's an element of a Bayern, but I don't think there's any club in the world like this, and certainly no club where it's as pronounced, where they just have this utter expectation to the point of near delusion that we're Madrid, we will win. It goes through players, stars, managers. I mean, look, like the managers are almost kind of immaterial to who actually wins. And that obviously kind of, it propels something. Again, institutional advantages or financial institutional advantages greatly help there, but it does precede some of this when football was a bit more kind of meritocratic. But it also, even in that kind of mindset, it reminds me of something that Chris Sutton once said, and he was talking about he was talking about great strikers and what really kind of sets them apart. And the word he used was delusion. It's not that they do things badly or can't miss sitters. It's that they allow failure to affect them to much less than anyone else. Like they can just get on with it. And I suppose you can extrapolate that to, these kind of, some of these repeat teams. And like, what equivalents have there been in England like that? I suppose Manchester United under Ferguson, but really only under Ferguson. So that's kind of based to one man rather than necessarily the club. And also Liverpool through the boot room era.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was going to, Wilson, I'll put this to you, because you kind of brought up how Bayern won 10 in a row. I mean, I think people sort of take for granted that PSG, even under the Qataris, Montpellier, Lille and Monaco have won the league in that time, but everyone just looks at that league and thinks, yeah, unless PSG mess up massively, they're going to win it. Juventus had their 9 in a row era. And we kind of tell ourselves that in the Premier League, this doesn't happen. But I mean, Miguel's remarked on the boot room era, where I think between 1975 and 1990, Liverpool won 10 or 15 league championships. In the 90s, United won 7 of 10. Going into the beginning of last season, City, that documentary out 4 in a row, 4 in a row, which had never been done before in the Premier League. So it's different to Italy, where there was 9 in a row. It's different to Germany, where there's 10 in a row. But if you look at City beyond that 4 in a row, what is it? 6 in 8? Is this not just like something we tell ourselves at bedtime, or we have Keys and Gray reading us this bedtime story saying this doesn't happen in the Premier League? Yeah, it's the most competitive league in the world. When, give or take a year, teams are kind of as dominant in the Premier League as they have been in the Bundesliga, Serie A and Liga.
Look, I don't think it's good that teams can win 6 out of 7. I think that suggests. But the thing is, it can suggest two things. It can suggest either brilliance of that side, or it can suggest structural imbalances. And in that case, probably both. But I think what you've got to do is you've got to slightly zoom out and you've got to look at the bigger picture. And the 2 most successful teams in English league history have only won 20 each. Manchester United and Liverpool have won 20 league titles each. And that compared to every other league, actually maybe not France, but certainly compared to Germany, Spain, Italy, that is way lower. That realization the Victorians had when they established the league, the very first professional football league in the world understood this, and everybody else got it wrong, that obviously leagues lead to monopoly. And it's clear that they do. If you win the league, you have more fans want to watch you, so you make more money, so you can buy better players, so you're more likely to win. And this is going to create massive imbalances unless you put checks and balances in place. Now, to an extent, English football was lucky that its successful teams early on were Preston, Aston Villa, Everton, Sunderland. They weren't from massive cities. They weren't sort of massively rich and powerful. There was always at least a rival in that city, in Everton's case, or in Villa's case, to at least chip away at that a bit. But there was a levy that the home team had to pay the away team, which was a flat fee to start with. After the First World War, it became, I think it's 20% of gate receipts, just to try and balance out a bit. Having a massive stadium didn't guarantee you'd be the biggest team. The first attempt the maximum wage was brought in 1901, which endures through to the early 60s, which was not, although it rapidly became a way of suppressing players and keeping them in their place. At first, it was introduced to try and stop teams being able to say, right, we can pay you more, come and join us. It was to try and create stability and encourage players to stay at their clubs a little bit more. So I think English football really benefited from that. And what it's going through now, these sort of periods of Liverpool dominance in the 80s, United dominance in the 90s, City dominance more recently, is the fact that those checks and balances, and we need different ones now because the financial arrangements of all are different, but they've been removed. And so you can get that domination, but it's not as long reaching, it's not as far reaching in the past as it is elsewhere, and therefore the effects haven't been as damaging as yet.
Funny that you mentioned the kind of maximum wage there, because obviously what's been a discussion in the Premier League of the past week, well, I mean, and look, I should stress, given we did pods last week or the last 2 weeks on the purity of football, just the glory and emotion, and it has been pointed out how football immediately went from that and Ireland and Scotland and Curaçao to dry chats about votes, about regulation. But in club terms, these regulations are actually what kind of encourage these moments, what help Crystal Palace win the FA Cup. And so like anchoring, which is voted down, and I think that's significant itself, that's almost kind of like a mirror of the maximum wage, because it would have put an indirect cap on what the top clubs can pay their players, because it would have been kind of anchored to what the bottom club can make.
So yeah, anchoring is a multiple of the TV revenue of the bottom club, and you can't spend beyond that, right?
Yeah,
that was what anchoring was, yeah. And they voted that down.
That was voted down. We'll get to this in a few minutes, actually, but even on, like we were saying there about how it's 3 managers that have retained the title, and yes, they're brilliant managers who obviously they're among the greatest of all time, and sometimes we ascribe these things to almost kind of supernatural, mythical qualities they have. But it's because of their abilities, they're appointed to top clubs. But just as relevant, of course, is where they were. And like, to be fair, this is probably much more influential than who these men are, maybe bar Ferguson. Because if you look at the 3 examples of who's retained the title, Ferguson's United. Now, you couldn't have a greater example of winning at the right time in terms of when they started in the early 90s, as the Premier League started, and also football went through this kind of commercial boom from the outside, because United got that quicker than anyone else, to the point that my figures might be just slightly out here, but I think they're pretty close, which is, I think by around 1998, United had as much commercial revenue as both Arsenal and Liverpool combined. I mean, that's astonishing. We're the 2 next most successful clubs in England. Then a few years on, the next manager to retain it, Mourinho, well, what's that in the context of? It's Abramovich, who created the biggest inflationary event in English football history to that point. The way the kind of, the ability to pay, actually spending more money than anyone ever spent in a single summer. And again, you have the direct translation from, wages to where you finish in the league. And then, of course, Guardiola, who's just working in, the Abu Dhabi project, and kind of, there's never been a club or a football operation so anchored around one man with so few restrictions, bar kind of football's financial regulations, to just create this glory here. And that like, I think that's quite telling in itself. And yeah, it obviously, given we are talking about the wider structures behind these things, that's as relevant as the men who were there. But of course, these sort of operations pick managers as good as this.
What effects do you think these new rules will have in basically? I think there's a sense that the teams that all begin with B, your Brightfords, your Brightons, your Brentfords, your Bournemouths, are kind of unhappy with the move away from PSR, because it kind of takes away one of their USPs, which has been kind of player trading, in terms of that being included in the squad cost rule. So do you think, so that will benefit bigger clubs that have bigger stadiums, bigger commercial revenue, blah, 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 blah. Essentially, the big clubs. So is that going to make Leicester was, or you've rubbished Leicester's league in the course of this, but it makes a Leicester even harder. So,
like I would argue that one of the reasons that champions falter is because while the current financial situation in football means if you get it right, it almost has an amplifying effect, which is why we've seen so many high 90s point seasons. The flip side is, if there's any doubt, I think the Premier League has had enough competitive balance and vitality, which means from week to week you're going to quite difficult games at the very least. I think that has been a factor in why individual champions then struggle. In recent years, I think some of that has been a product that PSR has actually worked. And the peak for this was probably last season, where you have Crystal Palace win the FA Cup, and you have a lot of these teams you've mentioned who have really impressive seasons. And actually, a lot of the best performing players in the Premier League were, players like Semenyo, Eze, of course, when he was at Palace, because they could keep them, because they could withstand the financial power of the biggest clubs to a great degree. It's very telling there was a swing back to that in the summer where a lot of these players left, but not all of them. And now, in the first season almost after that, where we're kind of seeing the most pronounced effect of PSR in this way, the league just goes and votes in the other direction. So the big thing, as it was explained to me, why squad cost ratio is going to be difficult for these clubs. And it's going to it'll be better for those who either have immense revenue or very wealthy owners willing to back, is because, the phrase in the Premier League has been, it quote unquote allows ambition. But the question is, whose ambition? Right? Should ambition only be defined by how much money an owner wants us to put in? Is that what the Premier League should be based on? I don't think so. But sorry, the reason that this is such an issue is because the SEO regulations, which allow you to spend 85% of your football revenue, so stuff like kind of stadium sales, feasibly wouldn't be included, and it allows a 30% extra on top of that if you pay a levy. So if you get to 115%, you pay sanctions.
That's if you're really ambitious.
Yeah. But basically, those regulations are quite hard to comply with for teams without a revenue, without a wealthy backer. And they're going to make clubs like Bournemouth, Brighton even more dependent on player sales and constantly hitting that formula. And so essentially going to be further incentivized to lose their talent. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think it kind of promotes organic development of teams. And I think we will eventually see, I think there'll be issues with this in 3-4 years' time.
Wilson, any thoughts? I mean, do you think the state of the Premier League, you both have drunk the Keys and Grey Kool-Aid that it is the most competitive league in the world because Arne Slot, is finding it so difficult to retain a title. I mean,
Arne lost, as Keysy calls him.
Do you think going forward it's only going to get harder, or?
Well, I think success will be restricted to a smaller and smaller, or maybe not even a smaller and smaller coterie of clubs, but a coterie of clubs who are much further ahead of the rest. I mean, what frustrates me about this in a sort of, Miguel's gone through all the detail there, but what frustrates me about this is the way you get good legislation is you have a legislation and you see how it works. And it doesn't matter what legislation is, there are always unintended consequences you can't quite foresee. So the thing with PSR that nobody quite realised was the kind of bizarre incentivization to sell your academy products, which can't be good. That just doesn't make any sense. If you were designing a system properly, you'd be incentivized to develop your own talent and keep it. And secondly, the way it seems to benefit constant churn. If you get the fact that if you get £100 million by selling a player, that and then you buy a load of players on 5-year contracts, that essentially means you can spend £500 million. And so if you keep that churn going, then you sort of can amplify the amount you can spend in a way that sort of feels artificial and seems contrary to the intention of the regulations in the first place. So what frustrates me is that accepting those two things are not good. Could we not have found something within the existing PSR framework to make that work? But no, we've now got a whole new framework. We're going to find out what the unintended consequences are in the next 2 or 3 years. And then quite possibly by the time we get around to putting that right, the big clubs have worked out another way to benefit themselves, and we'll have a new framework of financial regulation that would be imposed again. Nobody can ever quite get to a position where the law's in place long enough to refine it into something that's actually sensible.
Wilson, I'm going to come with you with maybe the final thought on this. I mean, you've brought up Bela Gutmann, sort of Bela Gutmann talk about that. I remember he used to write articles about the 3-year rule from Gutmann and how teams would kind of go stale come year 3 and that sort of thing. Do you think we're living in an even more accelerated world where, Gutmann's rule has to be revised to be like, it's the 1-year rule now?
Yeah, Gutmann, the 3rd year is fatal. Gutmann would have been brilliant on social media. It's a real shame that he didn't live in the social media world, because he was
AI will give us Gutmann on social media, I'm sure.
He was incredibly irascible, incredibly sort of quick to take offense, and incredibly keen to let people know that he had taken offense, and also had a great way of expressing that offense. And the fact we missed out on him sending barbed tweets, Instagram messages to his directors or former directors, I think is
curses, just cursing.
Well,
people.
Curses, yeah.
Yeah.
That is a great shame. But possibly, had he lived in that era, the news cycle contracts, it goes around faster, and maybe it's not the 3rd year, maybe it's the 3rd game that is fatal these days.
Mick, you're wearing a Sampdoria shirt, having kind of thrown mud at the name of Roberto Mancini, which I find is
well, just relaying. Is this quite retro? It's from 2018. It's not really retro.
Sam currently in the relegation zone in the 2nd division, whilst Mancini has gone to work in Qatar because he wanted to complete the set, having worked for Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Final thought, Mick?
On the whole thing, Osasuna lost to Real Sociedad this weekend. It's in danger of relegation for the first time in some time for a club that had been a model club.
Wow. You see, listeners, it's all it's taken is a few days for Miguel to turn Basque again.
How was it Basque? Let's our family, our side of the family identifies as Spanish. We do have cousins that would, consider themselves Basque, and we have great respect for their self-expression, but we are Spanish.
Well, on that note, Viva España. We will be back later this week for another episode where I think other members of Libero will be talking about the future of how we watch football. This is in the wake of the news that TNT Sport has lost the rights for the Champions League from 2027 and Paramount are coming in. So quite literally, watch this space. And thank you very much.